The billionaire promised her a cold marriage of status. Until passion broke every rule he ever made. Before we begin, drop a comment telling us which city you're watching from. And once the story ends, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Oh, and make sure to follow our channel for more stories like this. Now, sit back and enjoy every detail. Some decisions are made in boardrooms. Others are born from desperation. The morning sun cast sharp shadows across the glass walls of Caldwell Technologies' 42nd floor, but Damon Caldwell barely noticed. His steel-gray eyes were fixed on the newspaper spread across his mahogany desk, the headline screaming in bold letters, "Tech Mogul's Third Scandal. Is Damon Caldwell unsuitable for business?" He didn't flinch, didn't curse, didn't even blink. At 40, Damon had learned that emotions were expensive luxuries he couldn't afford. Every reaction was calculated, every word measured, every breath controlled. It's what had built his empire from a small medical device startup into a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate. But today, that control was being questioned. "The board meeting starts in 10 minutes, his assistant Marcus announced, stepping into the office with the kind of careful precision that came from working for a man who noticed everything. Damon folded the newspaper with deliberate slowness. They're scared. Shouldn't they be? The stock dropped 12% overnight. For the first time that morning, something flickered across Damon's face. Not fear, but calculation. He straightened his Italian silk tie and stood, his 6'2" frame commanding the space around him. Fear makes people do desperate things, Marcus. Sometimes that works in our favor. The boardroom fell silent the moment Damon entered. 12 of the most powerful investors in medical technology sat around the oval table, their faces wearing expressions ranging from concern to barely concealed panic. "Gentlemen," Damon said, taking his seat at the head of the table. "Ladies," Charles Whitmore, the eldest board member and the one man who dared to challenge Damon before, cleared his throat. "We need to address the elephant in the room, Damon." "Which elephant would that be? The one where our quarterly profits exceeded projections by 18%? Or the one where we just secured the largest government contract in company history? The one where your personal life is affecting our public image?" Whitmore shot back. "This is the third scandal this year. First the divorce allegations, then the insider trading rumors, now this nonsense about hostile takeovers. Our shareholders are getting nervous." Damon's fingers drummed once against the table, just once. And we think it's time you settled down." The silence that followed could have cut glass. Damon studied each face around the table, reading them like financial reports. Anxiety, determination, desperation. "You want me to get married. We want you to project stability," corrected Elena Vasquez, the sharpest investor in the room. "Marriage implies responsibility, commitment, the kind of image that reassures stakeholders that their CEO isn't going to make impulsive decisions that cost them money." Damon leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Marriage is a contract, gentlemen, like any other business arrangement. The question is, what are the terms?" 3 hours later, Damon stood in his office, staring out at the city below. Chicago stretched endlessly before him, a maze of glass and steel and ambition. Somewhere in that maze was his answer. His phone buzzed with a text from his private investigator. "Found 3 candidates that fit your criteria. Sending files now." The files appeared in his email within minutes. 3 women, all employees of Caldwell subsidiaries, all with clean backgrounds and financial need that would make them amenable to unconventional arrangements. The first, Lauren Pierce, 29, accounting manager, divorced, 1 child, moderate debt. The second, Natalie Cross, 31, marketing director, single, student loans, ambitious but overlooked. The third made him pause. Avery Bennett, 27, biomedical engineer at Caldwell Medical Devices, brilliant academic record from Northwestern, currently supporting an ailing mother, significant medical debt, no social media presence, no scandals, no complications, and absolutely beautiful. Damon studied her employee photo. Natural blonde hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, intelligent green eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, a smile that seemed genuine despite the corporate setting. She looked real. Authentic, exactly what his image needed. He picked up his phone and dialed. "Marcus, I need you to arrange a meeting, discreetly." "With whom?" "My future wife." 20 minutes later, Avery Bennett was standing in a cramped supply closet at Caldwell Medical Devices, counting inventory, and wondering how her engineering degree had led to this particular career highlight. Her phone had been buzzing all afternoon, Her mother's home nurse, the mortgage company, the insurance provider who kept finding new reasons to deny claims. She was so absorbed in her phone that she didn't hear the footsteps approaching until a voice cut through her concentration. "Miss Bennett?" Avery spun around, nearly dropping her clipboard. Standing in the doorway was a man who looked like he'd walked out of a business magazine. Tall, impeccably dressed, with the kind of presence that made the air feel thinner. It took her a moment to recognize him. "Mr. Caldwell?" Her voice came out smaller than intended. What are you doing here? I have a proposition for you." Something in his tone made her set down her clipboard. "What kind of proposition?" "The kind that could solve all your financial problems." His steel gray eyes met hers directly. "In exchange for a small favor." Avery felt her heart start to race. "I don't understand." "Have dinner with me tonight, Miss Bennett. 8 o'clock, the signature room, and I'll explain everything." Before she could respond, he was gone, leaving only the faint scent of expensive cologne and a business card on the supply shelf. Avery stared at the card, her hands trembling slightly. She thought about her mother's latest medical bills, about the second mortgage she'd taken out to pay for treatments, about the dreams she'd put on hold to keep their small world from falling apart. She thought about the look in Damon Caldwell's eyes, calculating, determined, and somehow desperate. What kind of favor could a billionaire possibly need from someone like me? What happens when desperation meets opportunity? Sometimes it creates the perfect storm, and sometimes it changes everything. The most dangerous contracts are the ones written with desperation. Avery Bennett had changed outfits 3 times before settling on a simple black dress that she'd bought for her college graduation 4 years ago. Standing in the elevator of the John Hancock building, watching the numbers climb toward the 95th floor, she wondered if she was making the biggest mistake of her life. The signature room's hostess led her to a corner table where Damon Caldwell was already waiting. He'd traded his business suit for dark jeans and a charcoal sweater, but somehow he still looked like he owned everything around him, which Avery realized he probably did. "You came," he said, standing as she approached. "You made it sound important." Avery slid into the seat across from him, acutely aware that her entire outfit probably cost less than his watch. "Though I have to admit, I'm curious why a billionaire needs anything from a supply room inventory specialist." Something that might have been amusement flickered across his face. "You're not a supply room specialist. You're a biomedical engineer with a master's degree from Northwestern, a 3.9 GPA, and 3 patents pending on cardiovascular monitoring devices." Avery blinked. "You researched me?" "I research everyone I do business with." He signaled the waiter. "Wine? I don't think I should drink until I know what this is about." "Smart." Damon leaned forward, his elbows on the table. "Tell me about your mother." The question hit like a physical blow. "Excuse me?" "Lillian Bennett, age 58, diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's 3 years ago. Currently receiving care at Willowbrook Memory Center, costing approximately $8,000 per month. Your insurance covers 60%. Avery's hands clenched in her lap. "How dare you? Your second mortgage is 3 months behind. Your credit cards are maxed out. Last month you sold your car to pay for her medication." His voice remained perfectly calm, as if he were discussing the weather. "You take the bus to work every day and live on ramen noodles so she can have the best care available." "Stop." The word came out strangled. "Just stop. I'm not judging you, Miss Bennett. I'm offering you a solution." Avery stared at him, her heart pounding. "What kind of solution?" Damon reached into his jacket and placed a single sheet of paper on the table between them. "A contract." She glanced down at the document, her eyes catching phrases that made no sense. "Conjugal arrangement. Public appearances. Termination after 24 months. I don't understand." "I need a wife," Damon said simply. "You need financial security. This arrangement would solve both our problems." The words hung in the air like smoke. Avery felt the world tilt slightly off its axis. "You want me to marry you?" "It would be a business transaction. Nothing more." He pulled out a pen and set it beside the paper. 2 years. "You would live in my house, accompany me to social functions, present the image of a stable, committed relationship. In return, all your mother's medical expenses would be covered indefinitely. Your debts would be cleared, and you would receive $5 million at the contract's conclusion." $5 million. The number echoed in her head like a bell. $5 million would change everything. Her mother could have the best care available. She could go back to school, pursue her research, maybe even start her own company. There would be rules, Damon continued. No romantic involvement, no emotional attachment. Separate bedrooms, separate lives. The only time we'd interact would be for public appearances. Avery's throat felt dry. And after 2 years? We divorce quietly. Irreconcilable differences. You disappear with your money and I maintain the image of someone capable of commitment. Why me? For the first time that evening, Damon seemed to consider his words carefully. You're unknown. Intelligent enough to handle the role convincingly, and you have the most compelling reason to say yes. The waiter approached with menus, but Damon waved him away. We need a few more minutes. Avery stared down at the contract, the legal language swimming before her eyes. This is insane. Is it? You're drowning in debt trying to care for someone you love. I need to project stability to protect a company that employs 30,000 people. It's a mutually beneficial arrangement. It's marriage, Avery whispered. It's a contract, Damon corrected, with clear terms and expectations. She thought about her mother who had taught her that love was the only thing worth fighting for. What would Lillian Bennett say about her daughter selling herself for money? But then she remembered her mother as she was now, confused, frightened, sometimes not even recognizing the daughter who visited every day. I need time to think about this. You have until tomorrow morning. Damon's tone suggested the timeline wasn't negotiable. My lawyer will need an answer by 9 a.m. Avery picked up the contract with shaking hands. And if I say no, then you go back to your supply closet and I find someone else. She stood up abruptly, clutching the papers. I should go. Miss Bennett. His voice stopped her as she turned away. For what it's worth, I think you're making the smart choice. I haven't made any choice yet. Haven't you? Avery looked back at him one more time. Damon Caldwell sat perfectly still, watching her with those calculating gray eyes. He looked like a man who always got what he wanted. And for the first time in 3 years, Avery Bennett looked like a woman who might actually have options. The elevator ride down felt like falling. That night, Avery sat in her tiny apartment. The contract spread across her kitchen table next to a stack of medical bills. Her neighbor's TV was too loud through the thin walls. Her refrigerator hummed with the sound of something dying. Outside, Chicago stretched endlessly in all directions, full of people who had never had to choose between love and money. She picked up her phone and almost called her best friend Melissa, almost called her father in Oregon, almost called anyone who might tell her she was crazy to even consider this. Instead, she found herself dialing Willowbrook Memory Center. Hi, Mrs. Rodriguez. It's Avery. How was Mom today? The nurse's voice was gentle. She had a good morning. She was asking for you around lunchtime, but then she got confused and thought you were her sister Katie. Avery closed her eyes. Her Aunt Katie had died when Avery was 12. The doctor wants to discuss adjusting her medication again. The new formula is more expensive, but it might help with the anxiety episodes. More expensive. Everything was always more expensive. I'll call him tomorrow, Avery said. After she hung up, she sat in the darkness of her apartment and read the contract again. Every clause, every condition, every escape route. It was thorough, professional, and completely insane, but it was also her mother's future. And maybe, just maybe, it was hers too. The hardest word to say is yes, when everything inside you is screaming no. At 8:47 a.m., Avery Bennett stood outside the glass towers of Caldwell Technologies, clutching a coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. She'd been awake all night pacing her small apartment, reading and rereading the contract until the words blurred together. $5 million. Her mother's medical care secured. A chance to breathe for the first time in 3 years. All she had to do was marry a stranger. The security guard in the lobby recognized her from yesterday and waved her toward the executive elevator. Mr. Caldwell is expecting you, miss. The ride to the 42nd floor felt both endless and too short. When the doors opened, Marcus was waiting with the kind of professional smile that revealed nothing. Good morning, Miss Bennett. Right this way. Damon's office looked different in the morning light, less imposing somehow, though no less impressive. He stood with his back to the door, phone pressed to his ear, speaking in rapid-fire sentences about quarterly projections and market fluctuations. I'll call you back, he said into the phone, then turned. Miss Bennett, I was starting to think you'd changed your mind. I almost did. Avery set her cold coffee on his desk and pulled the contract from her purse. I have questions. I'd be disappointed if you didn't. He gestured to the chairs facing his desk. Please. Avery remained standing. The medical coverage for my mother. What happens if her condition worsens? If she needs experimental treatments? All covered. No limits. And if this arrangement ends early? If one of us wants out before the 2 years? Page 4, Clause 12. Early termination requires a 6-month notice period and forfeiture of half the final payment. She'd read that part 3 times during the night. What about my job? You'll quit Caldwell Medical. It would look strange for my wife to work in a supply closet. He moved to the window, hands clasped behind his back. You'll receive a monthly allowance of $20,000 for personal expenses. $20,000. More than she made in 4 months at her current job. I need to know about the physical expectations. Damon turned, one eyebrow raised. Meaning? The contract mentions public appearances. Hand-holding, I assume. Maybe. She felt heat rise in her cheeks. Kissing. For photos. Minimal physical contact. Whatever's necessary to maintain the illusion. His tone was clinical, businesslike. Nothing that would make either of us uncomfortable. And in private? In private, we're strangers who happen to share an address. Avery nodded, though something about his answer felt hollow. She pulled out a pen, her own, not the expensive one he'd offered yesterday. One more thing, she said. I want to visit my mother every day. That's non-negotiable. Agreed. She looked down at the signature line, her hand trembling slightly. 2 years. 2 years. And then we're strangers again. Complete strangers. Avery Bennett took a deep breath and signed her name. The moment her pen lifted from the paper, everything changed. Damon's posture shifted subtly, becoming more formal, more distant. The man who had seemed almost human yesterday was gone, replaced by something that felt more like a business partner. Marcus will handle the logistics, he said, pressing a button on his intercom. Wedding arrangements, living situations, wardrobe consultations. The ceremony will be small, immediate family only if you have any preferences. My father lives in Oregon. He won't come. Why not? The question was asked without judgment, but Avery found herself defensive anyway. He thinks I should put my mother in a state facility and get on with my life. And you disagree. She raised me alone after he left when I was 8. She worked 2 jobs to put me through college. She deserves better than a warehouse where they park people to die. Something flickered across Damon's face. Recognition, perhaps, or understanding. Then it will just be us and the required witnesses. Marcus appeared in the doorway as if summoned by telepathy. Sir, Miss Bennett will need to be moved to the penthouse by Friday. Also arrange for her personal effects to be transported from her current residence and cancel her lease. Of course. Miss Bennett, if you could provide your current address. The next 2 hours passed in a blur of arrangements and signatures, bank account numbers, emergency contacts, clothing sizes for the appropriate wardrobe that someone named Vivian would select. Avery signed papers until her hand cramped, each signature feeling like a small death of her former life. One last thing, Damon said as Marcus gathered the documents. We'll need a story. How we met, why we fell in love quickly. I'm not good at lying. Then we'll stick as close to the truth as possible. We met at the company. You impressed me with your intelligence and authenticity. I pursued you quietly because I valued privacy. A whirlwind romance that surprised everyone, including us. And people will believe that? They'll believe what they want to believe. Rich man falls for brilliant, beautiful woman from humble beginnings. It's a story people like. Beautiful. The word hung in the air between them. Avery caught her reflection in the window behind his desk. Pale skin, tired eyes, hair that needed cutting. She didn't feel beautiful. She felt like someone who had just sold herself. The wedding is scheduled for Friday afternoon, Marcus announced. City Hall, 2 o'clock. The press has already been notified of Mr. Caldwell's engagement, though no details about the bride have been released yet. The press? Avery's stomach lurched. The society pages will want photos, Damon explained. We'll give them exactly what they expect to see. By the time Avery left the building, her entire life had been dismantled and rebuilt. Her apartment lease terminated, her few possessions scheduled for pickup, her future mapped out in precise contractual terms. She walked to the bus stop out of habit, then remembered she didn't need to take the bus anymore. Instead, she hailed a taxi, the first time she'd done that in months without calculating whether she could afford it. Where to? The driver asked. Avery gave him the address of Willowbrook Memory Center. She needed to see her mother, to tell her the good news, that the medical bills were no longer a worry, that the experimental treatments were now possible, that everything was going to be okay. She would not tell her mother about the price of that security. The taxi pulled away from the curb, and Avery watched Caldwell Technologies disappear behind them. In 3 days, she would be Mrs. Damon Caldwell. In 3 days, she would be living a life that belonged to someone else entirely. But her mother would be safe, and sometimes that was enough. Some vows are spoken in churches, others are signed in silence. Friday arrived with the kind of crisp October morning that made Chicago look like a postcard. Avery stood in front of the full-length mirror in the penthouse guest bedroom that had become hers 3 days ago, staring at a reflection she barely recognized. The woman looking back at her wore a cream-colored silk dress that probably cost more than her old monthly rent. Her hair had been styled by someone named Anton, who spoke only in artistic size and charged more per hour than most people made in a week. Her makeup was flawless, applied by hands that had worked on magazine covers and red carpets. She looked exactly like the kind of woman who would marry Damon Caldwell. She looked nothing like herself. "Miss Bennett?" Vivian, the stylist Marcus had hired, appeared in the doorway holding a small velvet box. "Mr. Caldwell asked me to give you this." Inside the box sat a ring that took Avery's breath away. A simple platinum band with a single perfect diamond that caught the morning light and threw it back in brilliant fragments. It was elegant, tasteful, and utterly beautiful. It was also completely fake, like everything else about this day. "It's lovely," Avery managed. "He has excellent taste," Vivian agreed, helping slide the ring onto Avery's finger. "Though I suspect you already knew that." The ring felt heavier than it looked. Avery stared down at her hand, at the symbol of a promise that would never be real, and wondered if this was how actors felt when they stepped onto a stage. "The car will be here in 20 minutes, Vivian continued, gathering her supplies. "Try to eat something. Wedding nerves can make people faint, and that wouldn't photograph well." Wedding nerves. As if this were a real wedding with real emotions instead of a carefully orchestrated business transaction. But as Avery picked at the fruit and pastries that had been delivered to the penthouse, she realized her hands were shaking, not from love or joy or anticipation, but from something that felt suspiciously like grief. 24 hours ago, she had been Avery Bennett, struggling biomedical engineer with dreams bigger than her bank account. In 2 hours, she would be Mrs. Damon Caldwell, wealthy woman with no identity beyond her husband's name. The transformation felt like drowning in silk. The ride to City Hall passed in a blur of Chicago traffic and small talk from the driver, who didn't know he was taking her to sell her soul. Avery watched the city scroll past the tinted windows, thinking about all the Friday afternoon she'd taken the bus to visit her mother, counting quarters for the fare. Those days felt like they belonged to someone else now. City Hall was exactly what she'd expected. Efficient, impersonal, with the kind of fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly dead. Marcus was waiting in the lobby with a man Avery didn't recognize, and a woman with a camera who looked bored. "Miss Bennett," Marcus said with his professional smile. "This is Judge Patterson, who will be performing the ceremony, and Claire Morrison from the Tribune Society section." The photographer looked up from her camera with sudden interest. "So you're the mystery woman who caught Damon Caldwell." Avery forced a smile. "I guess I am. How does it feel to be marrying one of Chicago's most eligible bachelors?" The question hung in the air like a trap. Avery glanced at Marcus, who gave her an encouraging nod. "I feel like the luckiest woman in the world," she heard herself say. The words tasted like ash. Damon arrived precisely at 2 o'clock, looking like he'd stepped out of a magazine spread. His charcoal suit was perfectly tailored, his silver tie catching the light in a way that seemed calculated. When he saw her, something flickered across his face. Surprise, perhaps, or approval. "You look beautiful," he said, and for a moment it almost sounded genuine. "Thank you." She gestured to her dress, her hair, her entire transformed appearance. "Your stylist is very good." She had excellent material to work with. The compliment caught her off guard. Before she could respond, Judge Patterson was calling them forward. The ceremony itself lasted exactly 7 minutes. Avery would remember later how surreal it felt, standing there reciting vows that meant nothing while cameras flashed and strangers watched. Damon's hand was warm when he slipped a matching platinum band onto her finger. His voice was steady as he promised to love, honor, and cherish her until death do them part. When the judge pronounced them husband and wife, Damon leaned in to kiss her. It was brief, professional, and completely without emotion, but as his lips touched hers, Avery felt something shift inside her chest. Not love, but awareness. He smelled like expensive cologne and something uniquely his own. His hand on her waist was gentle but firm. For one impossible moment she wondered what it would feel like if this were real. The thought terrified her. "Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Caldwell," Judge Patterson announced. And just like that, Avery Bennett ceased to exist. The photographer took exactly 14 photos. Avery would know because she would count them later when they appeared in the society pages. Damon's arm around her waist, her hand resting on his chest, the diamonds catching the light. Both of them smiling with the kind of happiness that looked perfect in newsprint. None of the photos captured the careful distance in their eyes. Beautiful couple, Claire Morrison commented, scribbling notes. How long have you been together? Long enough to know, Damon answered smoothly. Sometimes you just know. He was good at this, Avery realized. Good at saying things that sounded romantic but revealed nothing. Good at playing the role of a man in love. She wondered if he'd had practice. The reception was champagne in Marcus's office with the witnesses, polite conversation about the weather and Damon's latest business ventures. Avery sipped her drink and smiled at the appropriate moments, feeling like she was watching someone else's life unfold. You did well, Damon murmured as they posed for one final photo. I'm a quick learner. Good. We'll need to be convincing going forward. Going forward. As if their entire marriage was just an extended performance with a 2-year run. By 4 o'clock it was over. Avery found herself back in the penthouse, still wearing her wedding dress, still feeling like someone else entirely. Damon had disappeared into his home office with a stack of contracts, and the silence felt oppressive. She called Willowbrook Memory Center. Hi, Mrs. Rodriguez, it's Avery. How is she today? Oh, congratulations, dear. We saw the announcement in the paper. Your mother was so excited when I showed her the photo. Avery's throat tightened. She understood? She had a very clear moment. Said her little girl looked like a princess. After she hung up, Avery sat in the enormous living room of her new home, still wearing her wedding dress, still wearing rings that felt like beautiful chains. Outside, Chicago glittered in the afternoon sun, full of people living real lives with real choices. She was Mrs. Damon Caldwell now, wealthy, secure, trapped, and she had never felt more alone. The hardest distance to cross isn't measured in miles. It's measured in silence. 3 weeks into her marriage, Avery had mastered the art of being invisible. She learned Damon's schedule by heart, up at 5:30 a.m. for his workout, breakfast alone while reading financial reports, out the door by 7:15. She timed her own mornings to avoid him, slipping into the kitchen only after she heard the elevator doors close. The penthouse was large enough that they could go days without crossing paths. And they did. Mrs. Caldwell? Rosa, the housekeeper, appeared in the doorway of what had become Avery's study. Your mother called. She wants to know if you're coming today. Avery looked up from her laptop, where she'd been researching graduate programs she might never attend. Of course. Can you have the driver ready in an hour? Of course. Rosa hesitated. She also asked if you're bringing your husband today. The question hung in the air like an accusation. In 3 weeks of marriage, Damon had never once asked about her mother, had never offered to visit, had never shown the slightest curiosity about the woman whose medical bills were the reason for their arrangement. Not today, Avery said quietly. That afternoon, sitting in her mother's room at Willowbrook, Avery tried to explain why her new husband was always mysteriously busy whenever visiting hours came up. He's very important, Mom. Lots of meetings. Lillian Bennett looked at her daughter with eyes that were sometimes clear, sometimes cloudy, but always full of love. Today was a good day. She recognized Avery, remembered the wedding photo, even asked about the enormous ring that caught the afternoon light. Important is nice, sweetheart, but kind is better. Her mother's voice was soft but certain. Is he kind to you? The question was harder to answer than it should have been. Damon wasn't unkind. He was polite, distant, professionally courteous. He made sure she had everything she needed. Credit cards, allowance, access to the car and driver. He asked about her day when they happened to encounter each other in the hallway. But kind. Kindness required caring, and caring was explicitly forbidden by their contract. He takes good care of me, Avery said instead. That's not what I asked. Sometimes her mother's clarity was a blessing. Sometimes it felt like having her heart examined under a microscope. That evening, Avery arrived home to find Damon in the kitchen, a rare occurrence that made her stop short in the doorway. He stood at the marble island, still wearing his work clothes but with his tie loosened, eating what looked like leftover Chinese takeout directly from the container. Sorry, she said, backing toward the door. I didn't know you were. It's your kitchen too, he said without looking up. You don't have to leave. Avery hesitated, then moved to the refrigerator. Rosa always kept it stocked with fresh fruits and vegetables that mostly went uneaten since Avery usually grabbed something quick before her daily visits to see her mother. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft clink of Damon's fork against the takeout container. Finally, he spoke. "How is she?" The question was so unexpected that Avery nearly dropped the apple she was washing. "Who?" "Your mother. You visit her every day." "She's—" Avery searched for words that wouldn't reveal too much. "Some days are better than others. Today was good." She remembered the wedding. Damon nodded, still not looking at her. "Alzheimer's is unpredictable. You know about it?" "I researched it. After—" He gestured vaguely between them, presumably meaning their arrangement. "I wanted to understand what we were dealing with." Something warm and unexpected stirred in Avery's chest. Most people don't bother to research it. Most people don't have their financial future tied to someone dealing with it. The warmth died. Right. This was business. Everything was business. "Of course," she said quietly. They ate in silence after that. If standing on opposite sides of a kitchen island could be called eating together. Avery finished her apple and was rinsing the core when Damon spoke again. "There's a charity gala next Friday. Healthcare innovation. We need to attend together. Our first real public appearance as a married couple." The thought made her stomach tighten. "What do I need to know?" "Vivian will handle your wardrobe. The guest list will include several board members, some competitors, and various society types who donate money to feel important." He set down his fork. "We'll need to look comfortable with each other." "Comfortable how?" "Like a couple who's been married for a month, who chose to be there together." Avery nodded, though the idea of pretending to be comfortable with Damon felt impossible. They couldn't even eat in the same room without awkwardness. "I should probably know some basic things about you," she said, "in case people ask questions." For the first time that evening, Damon looked directly at her. "What do you want to know?" "Anything. Everything. I don't even know your middle name." "James. Damon James Caldwell." "Favorite color?" "I don't have one." "Everyone has a favorite color. I have preferences based on context. Navy for business suits, white for dress shirts, black for evening wear." Avery stared at him. "That's the most depressing thing I've ever heard." Something that might have been amusement flickered across his face. "What's yours?" "Green. Like the color of leaves in spring when everything's starting over." "That's very—" He seemed to search for the right word. "Optimistic. I used to be an optimistic person." The words slipped out before she could stop them, carrying more weight than she'd intended. Damon's expression shifted slightly, becoming more focused. "Used to be?" Avery shrugged, suddenly self-conscious. 3 years of watching someone you love disappear a little more each day changes your perspective on fresh starts. "And now?" "Now I'm married to a stranger who doesn't have a favorite color, living in a house that doesn't feel like home, pretending to be someone I'm not." She met his eyes. "I'd say my optimism is officially on life support." The silence that followed felt different from their usual careful distance. Heavier, more honest. "For what it's worth," Damon said finally, "I think optimism is overrated anyway." Spoken like a true pessimist. Realist. Same thing. Different packaging. He almost smiled. Almost. Maybe. That night, lying in her enormous bed in her beautiful guest room, Avery thought about the conversation in the kitchen. It was the longest they'd talked since their wedding day, and definitely the most honest. She wondered if Damon was lying in his own enormous bed 3 doors down, thinking about it too. She wondered if he ever thought about her at all. Outside her window, Chicago glittered like a promise someone forgot to keep. In 6 days, she would have to stand beside her husband at a charity gala and convince a room full of strangers that they were happy together. The irony wasn't lost on her that the hardest role she'd ever have to play was that of a woman in love. Sometimes the most dangerous moment is when pretending starts to feel real. The grand ballroom of the Palmer House Hotel looked like something out of a fairy tale. Crystal chandeliers casting warm light over tables draped in ivory silk, centerpieces of white orchids, and silver candles. Chicago's elite dressed in their finest as they wrote checks to ease their consciences. Avery stood at the entrance beside Damon, her hand resting lightly on his arm, and tried to remember how to breathe. "You look stunning," he murmured, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Try to relax." Easier said than done. The emerald green gown Vivian had selected made Avery feel like she was playing dress-up in someone else's life. The fabric was silk so fine it felt like water, cut to follow her curves in ways that made her hyper-aware of every movement. Diamond earrings borrowed from some exclusive jeweler, caught the light every time she turned her head. She looked like she belonged here. She felt like a fraud. Mr. and Mrs. Caldwell, a woman with perfectly coiffed silver hair and a smile that could power the city, approached them. Congratulations on your recent marriage. I'm Catherine Whitmore, Charles's wife. Charles Whitmore, one of the board members who had insisted Damon needed to settle down. Avery forced her brightest smile. Mrs. Whitmore, how lovely to meet you. Please call me Catherine. We're practically family now that Damon has finally found someone special enough to steal his heart. Avery felt Damon's arm tense slightly under her hand. I'm the lucky one, she replied, glancing up at him with what she hoped looked like adoration. How did you two meet? Charles mentioned you work for the company, but I'm dying to hear the romantic details. This was the moment they'd rehearsed. Avery let her smile turn shy. It wasn't very romantic at first. I was buried in inventory reports when Mr. Caldwell, Damon, appeared in my supply room like some kind of corporate angel. Corporate angel? Catherine laughed delightedly. How charming. I was impressed by her efficiency, Damon added, his hand covering Avery's where it rested on his arm, and her complete lack of interest in impressing me. The touch sent an unexpected jolt through Avery's system. His fingers were warm, gentle, and the gesture looked so natural she almost believed it herself. Love at first sight? Catherine pressed. More like love at first argument, Avery said, surprised by how easily the lie flowed. I told him his inventory system was inefficient. She was right, Damon said, and something in his tone made Avery look up at him. He was looking down at her with an expression she'd never seen before. Soft, almost tender. She's usually right about everything. For a moment, Avery forgot they were acting. The rest of the cocktail hour passed in a blur of introductions and small talk. Damon was masterful at working the room, guiding her from group to group with a hand at the small of her back, including her in conversations about medical innovations and charitable foundations. He introduced her as my brilliant wife, with such conviction that Avery began to believe it herself. You're good at this, she whispered as they moved toward their assigned table. So are you. That story about the inventory system was inspired. It's actually true. Your system is terrible. He looked genuinely surprised. Really? Really? You're losing at least 15% efficiency in parts tracking alone. We'll have to discuss that later. His hand found hers as they approached their table. Right now, we have an audience. Their table mates included 2 other board members with their wives, a prominent surgeon and his husband, and a tech entrepreneur who clearly viewed Damon as competition. The conversation flowed from healthcare policy to investment strategies to the upcoming charity auction. Avery has some fascinating insights on biomedical engineering, Damon said when the surgeon asked about her background. She's been working on cardiovascular monitoring innovations. Avery blinked in surprise. She'd mentioned her patents exactly once, weeks ago during their dinner negotiation. She hadn't realized he'd remembered. How exciting, the surgeon's husband said. Are you planning to continue your research? Avery glanced at Damon, uncertain. They'd never discussed her future work. I hope so. She's being modest, Damon said smoothly. Her preliminary work on non-invasive arterial pressure monitoring could revolutionize emergency medicine. The conversation that followed was the first time in months that Avery felt like herself, discussing research methods and clinical applications, debating the ethics of medical device pricing with people who understood the complexities involved. She forgot about the cameras, forgot about the performance, forgot about everything except the pure joy of talking about work she was passionate about. It wasn't until she felt Damon's thumb brushing across her knuckles that she realized he'd been holding her hand the entire time. Ladies and gentlemen, the evening's host called for attention. It's time for our charity auction to begin. What followed was a display of wealth that made Avery dizzy. A week in Tuscany sold for $50,000. A private dinner with a celebrity chef went for $35,000. A signed basketball from the Bulls brought in $28,000. And now, the auctioneer announced, a truly unique item. A weekend for 2 at the exclusive Blackberry Mountain Resort in Tennessee, complete with private spa treatments and gourmet dining. The bidding started at $5,000 and quickly escalated. Avery watched in fascination as paddles flew up around the room, the price climbing toward $20,000. $30,000, Damon said suddenly, his paddle raised. Avery stared at him. What are you doing? Supporting the cause, he said without looking at her. $35,000. Someone had bid against him. Avery could see the competitive glint in his eyes that she was beginning to recognize. $40,000, he called out. Damon, Avery whispered. It's just a weekend. 45,000, he said calmly. The other bidder hesitated, then shook his head. The auctioneer's gavel fell. Sold to Mr. Damon Caldwell for $45,000. The table erupted in applause. Avery leaned close to Damon's ear. $45,000 for a weekend we'll never actually take? Who says we won't take it? The question caught her off guard. Before she could respond, people were congratulating them on their romantic getaway, and Damon was accepting handshakes and praise for his generous donation. The rest of the evening passed in a haze of dancing and champagne. Damon was an excellent dancer, confident, graceful, leading her around the floor as if they'd been dancing together for years. When a slow song began, he pulled her closer, one hand at her waist, the other holding hers against his chest. "You're trembling," he observed quietly. "These shoes are higher than I'm used to. Is that the only reason?" Avery looked up at him, at the gray eyes that seemed less cold tonight, at the mouth that had spoken about her work with genuine pride. The scent of his cologne surrounded her, and she was acutely aware of how solid he felt beneath her hands. "No," she admitted. Something shifted in his expression. "Avery, I know," she said quickly. "I know what this is, what we are." But as they swayed together in the golden light of the ballroom, surrounded by music and the soft murmur of conversation, it was hard to remember that what they were was nothing at all. The drive home was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts. It wasn't until they were back in the penthouse, standing in the foyer, still dressed in their evening finery, that Damon spoke. "You were perfect tonight. So were you." Avery slipped off her heels, immediately losing 3 inches of height. "I almost believed it myself." Believed what? That we were happy. The words hung between them like a confession. Damon's tie was loosened, his hair slightly mussed from the evening, and in the soft light of the foyer, he looked younger somehow, more human. "Avery," he said quietly, "what are we doing?" It was the question she'd been afraid to ask herself, the question that had no safe answer. "I don't know," she whispered. "Some storms happen in the sky, others happen in your heart." 3 weeks after the charity gala, Avery was still thinking about the question Damon had asked in the foyer. "What are we doing?" The words echoed in her mind during their careful morning routines, their polite dinner conversations, their increasingly frequent glances across the penthouse. They'd settled into a strange new rhythm, not quite strangers, but not quite anything else either. He asked about her mother's condition. She inquired about his board meetings. Sometimes they ate breakfast at the same time, sharing sections of the newspaper in comfortable silence. It felt dangerously close to domestic. "Mrs. Caldwell?" Marcus appeared in the doorway of her study, where she'd been pretending to read while actually watching Damon swim laps in the building's pool 40 floors below. "Mr. Caldwell would like to see you in his office." Avery found Damon standing behind his desk, his expression unreadable. 2 plane tickets lay on the mahogany surface between them. "Paris," he said without preamble. "We leave tomorrow morning." "Paris?" Avery picked up one of the tickets, staring at her name. "Mrs. Avery Caldwell," printed in elegant script. "Why?" "Caldwell Technologies is finalizing a merger with a French biomedical company. I need to be there for the final negotiations, and it would look strange if my wife of 2 months didn't accompany me to such an important event. Of course, another performance, another opportunity to play the devoted couple for an audience of business associates and competitors. How long? 4 days, 3 nights. He moved around the desk, stopping close enough that she could smell his cologne. There will be dinners, meetings, a formal reception at the French embassy. Vivienne has already coordinated with designers in Paris for appropriate wardrobe. Avery nodded, trying to ignore the way her pulse quickened when he stood this close. "I'll pack tonight." "Avery." His voice stopped her as she turned to leave. "This will require more intimacy than the charity gala. We'll be staying in the same hotel suite, sharing spaces. People will expect to see a couple who are comfortable with each other." The implication hung in the air between them. Sharing spaces. Being alone together for 4 days in the most romantic city in the world. "I understand," she said, though she wasn't sure she understood anything anymore. The flight to Paris passed in a blur of first-class luxury that Avery tried not to enjoy too much. Damon worked on his laptop while she stared out the window, watching the Atlantic Ocean stretch endlessly below them. When the plane hit turbulence over the English Channel, she gripped her armrest so tightly her knuckles went white. "Afraid of flying?" Damon asked, closing his laptop. "Afraid of crashing," Avery corrected. "There's a difference. We're safer up here than we would be driving in Chicago traffic. Statistics don't help when you're 30,000 feet above the ocean. Without a word, Damon reached over and covered her hand with his. The gesture was so unexpected, so gentle that Avery forgot to breathe. Better? He asked quietly. It was better. Much better. And that terrified her more than the turbulence. The Hotel Plaza Athénée was exactly what Avery had expected from Damon's taste in accommodations. Elegant, luxurious, and intimidatingly expensive. Their suite overlooked the Eiffel Tower, which seemed almost too perfect to be real. 2 bedrooms, Damon said as they entered, gesturing to the doors on either side of the spacious living area. I thought you'd be more comfortable with— Thank you, Avery said quickly. That's very considerate. But as she unpacked in her bedroom, a confection of cream silk and antique French furniture, she found herself thinking about the other door, about Damon unpacking his own clothes just 20 feet away, about how thin hotel walls could be. Their first dinner was at a Michelin-starred restaurant with 3 of Damon's French business partners and their wives. Avery found herself seated between Pierre Dubois, the CEO of the company they were acquiring, and his wife Celeste, who spoke impeccable English and had a laugh like silver bells. How romantic, Celeste said, as the sommelier poured wine that probably cost more than Avery's old monthly rent. A business trip to Paris so early in your marriage? Damon must be very eager to show you our beautiful city. He's been the perfect tour guide, Avery replied, glancing at Damon across the table, though we haven't had much time for sightseeing yet. You must visit Sainte-Chapelle, Pierre suggested. The stained glass windows are magnificent, very romantic for newlyweds. We'll make time, Damon said, his eyes meeting Avery's. Some things are worth prioritizing. The conversation flowed around topics of business and culture, but Avery found herself distracted by Damon's presence beside her. He was different here somehow, more relaxed, more open. When he laughed at Pierre's stories about navigating French bureaucracy, the sound was genuine and warm. After dinner, they walked back to the hotel through the quiet Paris streets. The November air was crisp, but not cold, and the city lights reflected off the Seine like scattered diamonds. You were charming tonight, Damon said as they crossed Pont Alexandre III. So were you. I've never seen you so relaxed. Paris has that effect. Something about being away from Chicago, away from the usual pressures. He paused, looking out over the river. Thank you for being here. I know this wasn't part of our original arrangement. Actually, it was. The contract mentioned business travel. The contract mentioned a lot of things, Damon said quietly. But this feels like more than a contract obligation. Avery's heart skipped. What does it feel like? Before he could answer, fat raindrops began falling from the November sky. Within seconds, the light drizzle became a downpour. The hotel's just ahead, Damon said, taking her hand. Run! They ran through the rain, laughing breathlessly as they dodged puddles and late-night pedestrians. By the time they reached the hotel lobby, they were both soaked and giggling like teenagers. Your hair, Damon said, reaching up to brush a wet strand from her face. You look like a drowned mermaid. Very flattering, Avery managed, suddenly aware that his hand was still cupping her cheek. A beautiful drowned mermaid, he corrected softly. The elevator ride to their floor was silent except for the quiet hum of machinery and the rapid beating of Avery's heart. Their clothes were damp, their hair dripping, and the small space felt charged with electricity that had nothing to do with the storm outside. When the doors opened, they walked to their suite in careful silence. Damon's keycard beeped softly as he unlocked the door. I should— Avery gestured toward her bedroom. Change into something dry. Of course, but he didn't move away from her. Instead, he stood there in the doorway, studying her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed. Avery, what happened tonight? We got caught in the rain. That's not what I mean, and you know it. She did know it. She knew that something had shifted between them during dinner, during their walk, during the run through the rain. She knew that the careful distance they'd maintained for 2 months was crumbling, and she knew that acknowledging it would change everything. Damon, she whispered. I know, he said quietly. I know what the contract says. I know what we agreed to. But I can't stop thinking about you. The confession hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. This is dangerous, Avery said. I know. We could ruin everything. I know that too. Thunder rolled across the Paris sky and rain lashed against the windows of their suite. Outside, the Eiffel Tower sparkled through the storm, beautiful and untouchable. Inside, 2 people who had promised each other nothing stood on the edge of everything and wondered if some promises were meant to be broken. Sometimes the most important conversations happen in the spaces between words. For a moment that stretched like eternity. They stood in the doorway of their Parisian suite, the air thick with possibility and the scent of rain. Avery could hear her own heartbeat over the storm raging outside, could feel the weight of Damon's confession settling between them like a challenge. "We should," she started, then stopped, because every ending to that sentence felt wrong. Should what? Damon's voice was rougher than usual, and when she looked up at him, she saw something she'd never seen before in his steel-gray eyes. Vulnerability. Be practical. Remember why we're here. Think about the consequences. "I've been thinking about the consequences for weeks," he said quietly. "I've run through every possible scenario, every risk assessment, every logical outcome." He stepped closer, and Avery's breath caught. Logic doesn't seem to be working anymore. The confession hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. Avery pressed her back against the doorframe, acutely aware that one step forward would put her in his arms. "Damon, if we do this, if we cross this line." "I know." His hand came up to cup her face, thumb brushing across her cheekbone. "I know exactly what we stand to lose. Then why are you willing to risk it?" For a long moment he didn't answer. His eyes searched her face as if he were memorizing every detail. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because for the first time in my life, I think I understand what's worth risking everything for." Thunder crashed outside, and the lights flickered. In that moment of semi-darkness, something broke open between them. All the careful control, all the professional distance, all the walls they'd built to protect themselves from exactly this moment. When the lights steadied, Damon was closer, close enough that Avery could feel the warmth radiating from his body, could count the raindrops still clinging to his hair. "Tell me to stop," he whispered. "Tell me to go to my room and pretend this conversation never happened." Avery's heart hammered against her ribs. Every rational part of her brain screamed that she should do exactly that, should retreat to her bedroom, lock the door, and spend the rest of their Paris trip maintaining the careful distance that had kept them safe. Instead, she reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the sharp line of his jaw. "I can't," she breathed. The admission was barely out of her mouth before his lips found hers. The kiss was nothing like their wedding day peck, tentative and professional and performed for cameras. This was desperate, hungry, months of denied attraction and suppressed longing finally given voice. Avery's hands fisted in his damp shirt, pulling him closer as his arms wrapped around her, lifting her off her feet. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, the storm outside seemed like nothing compared to the one raging in the space between them. "Avery," Damon said her name like a prayer, his forehead resting against hers. "I don't know how to do this." "Do what? Feel this much? Want something this badly?" His voice was raw with honesty. "I've spent 40 years avoiding exactly this situation. And now I can't remember why avoiding it seemed so important." They stood there in the hallway, holding each other while rain lashed the windows and Paris sparkled through the storm. Avery could feel the moment balanced on a knife's edge. They could still step back, could still pretend this was just a moment of weakness brought on by wine and atmosphere and the romance of Paris. Or they could choose each other. "The suite has a fireplace," Damon said quietly. "We could talk. Just talk." Avery almost smiled at the transparent excuse. "Just talk? We have a lot to figure out." She looked up at him, at this man who had offered her a contract and somehow given her so much more. "Yes, we do." The living room of their suite was warm and elegant, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a perfect view of the Eiffel Tower sparkling through the rain. Damon built a fire in the marble fireplace while Avery changed into dry clothes, soft cashmere pants and a cream sweater that made her feel more like herself than the designer gowns ever had. When she emerged from her room, she found Damon sitting on the plush sofa, still wearing his damp dress shirt, but with the sleeves rolled up and the top buttons undone. He looked younger in the firelight, less like a billionaire CEO, and more like a man who had just admitted to feeling things he didn't understand. "Better?" he asked, as she settled beside him. "Much." She tucked her legs under her, suddenly shy. "So, we're talking now?" "We're talking." He turned to face her fully. "I should probably start by apologizing." "For what?" "For complicating things. For not being able to stick to the terms of our agreement. For making this harder than it needs to be." Avery studied his face in the flickering light. "What if I don't want an apology?" "What do you want?" The question was simple, but the answer felt impossibly complex. What did she want? To go back to the safety of their contract? To pretend her heart didn't race every time he smiled? To ignore the way he'd remembered every detail about her work, her dreams, her mother? I want honesty, she said finally. I want to know what this is, what we are. Damon was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. I don't know what we are, he admitted. I know what we were supposed to be. I know what the contract says. But somewhere between the charity gala and tonight, everything changed. When did you know? Know what? That this was more than just business. He turned to look at her, and the expression in his eyes made her breath catch. The night of the gala, when we were dancing and you looked up at me like... He paused, searching for words. Like I was someone worth looking at that way. You are, Avery said softly. You're so much more than you let people see. Avery. Her name was a whisper, a question, a confession all at once. I know this is complicated, she continued. I know we're risking everything we agreed to, but I can't pretend anymore that this is just a contract to me. What is it then? She met his eyes, her heart hammering with the weight of what she was about to admit. It's you. You asking about my mother. You remembering my work. You holding my hand during turbulence. You making me feel like I matter for reasons that have nothing to do with what I can do for you. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the crackle of the fire and the sound of rain against the windows. Damon reached out slowly, as if giving her time to pull away, and took her hand in his. You do matter, he said quietly. More than you know. Outside, Paris glittered through the storm, beautiful and eternal. Inside their suite, two people who had started as strangers held hands by the fire and admitted that somewhere along the way, they had become something neither of them had planned for, something that felt dangerously close to love. The cruelest thing about walls is how quickly they can be rebuilt, especially when fear is holding the hammer. Avery woke to soft morning light filtering through the sheer curtains of her Parisian bedroom and the distant sound of Damon's voice on a phone call. For a moment she allowed herself to remember the night before, sitting by the fire, his confession, the way he'd looked at her like she was something precious and unexpected. They had talked until nearly 3 a.m, sharing stories and secrets and silences that felt more intimate than any physical touch. When exhaustion finally claimed them, Damon had walked her to her bedroom door and kissed her forehead with such tenderness that Avery had nearly pulled him inside with her. Nearly. Now, listening to his businesslike tone through the walls, she wondered if the magic of the previous night had been real or just a product of Parisian atmosphere and too much wine. She found her answer when she emerged from her room 20 minutes later. Damon stood at the suite's dining table, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit, speaking rapid French into his phone while reviewing contracts spread across the white linen. He looked up when she entered, and for just a moment something soft flickered in his gray eyes. Then his expression shuddered, becoming professional and distant. I'll call you back, he said into the phone, ending the call. Good morning. I've ordered breakfast. It should arrive shortly. The formal tone hit Avery like cold water. Good morning, she replied carefully. You're up early. The merger documents require review before the final meeting this afternoon. He gestured to the papers without looking at her directly. I hope you slept well. I hope you slept well. As if she were a business associate. As if they hadn't sat inches apart on the sofa, sharing pieces of their souls until the fire burned down to embers. Damon, she started, but he was already moving toward his briefcase. Vivian has arranged for you to visit the Louvre this morning, he said, his voice carefully neutral. The car will be available whenever you're ready. The dismissal was subtle but unmistakable. Avery felt something cold settle in her chest. Will you be joining me? Unfortunately, I have back-to-back meetings until this evening's reception. He finally looked at her directly, and his expression was perfectly controlled. Business requires my full attention. Business. Not we need to talk about last night, or I can't stop thinking about what you said, or even I'm sorry but I'm terrified. Just business. Of course, Avery said quietly. Business first. Something flickered across his face. Regret, perhaps, or apology, but it was gone so quickly she might have imagined it. The day passed in a blur of forced tourism and growing dread. Avery wandered through the Louvre's endless galleries, staring at masterpieces without seeing them, her mind replaying every moment of the previous night. Had she misread the situation? Had the intimacy been one-sided? Or was Damon simply retreating into the safety of their original arrangement? When she returned to the hotel that afternoon, she found a garment bag hanging in her room with a note from Vivian. For tonight's reception, You'll look stunning. V. The dress was midnight blue silk, elegant and sophisticated, with a neckline that suggested rather than revealed. Avery stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror after she'd dressed, recognizing the woman who looked back. Polished, appropriate, perfectly suitable for a billionaire's wife. She looked nothing like the woman who had sat by the fire and bared her heart to a man who apparently regretted listening. The reception at the French embassy was exactly what Avery had expected. Elegant, formal, and filled with people who spoke in careful diplomatic language about everything and nothing. She stood beside Damon, playing her role perfectly, smiling at the right moments and making polite conversation with wives of executives and cultural attachés. To any observer, they looked like the perfect couple, but Avery could feel the careful distance Damon maintained, physical and emotional. When he touched her, it was for appearances only. When he spoke to her, it was with professional courtesy. When she tried to catch his eye, he was always looking somewhere else. "You're very quiet tonight," Pierre Dubois observed during a lull in conversation. "Everything all right, ma chérie?" "Just tired," Avery replied with a smile that felt like it might crack her face. "It's been a wonderful trip, but I'm not used to such a busy schedule." "Ah, the price of marrying a workaholic," Pierre's wife Celeste laughed. "Though I must say Damon seems more relaxed than usual. Love suits him." Avery glanced across the room to where Damon was deep in conversation with the French Minister of Health, his expression serious and focused. He looked exactly like he had 2 months ago, controlled, professional, untouchable. "Yes," she murmured. "Love suits him perfectly." The flight back to Chicago the next morning was a study in polite distance. Damon worked on his laptop while Avery stared out the window, both of them maintaining the careful silence they'd perfected over their first month of marriage. It wasn't until they were back in the penthouse, standing in the familiar space that had witnessed their tentative steps toward something real, that Avery finally found her voice. "We need to talk." Damon paused in the act of loosening his tie. "About what?" "About what happened in Paris. About what you said. About why you're pretending it never happened." "I'm not pretending anything," he said carefully. "I'm being realistic." "Realistic about what?" "About what this is. What we are." He turned away from her, staring out at the Chicago skyline. What happened in Paris was a mistake. The word hit like a physical blow. A mistake? An emotional miscalculation brought on by circumstances and atmosphere. It doesn't change the fundamental nature of our arrangement. Avery stared at his back, at the rigid line of his shoulders, at the careful distance he'd put between them. "So that's it? We go back to being strangers who share an address? We go back to honoring the terms of our contract? What about what you said? About understanding what's worth risking everything for?" Finally, he turned to face her, and the expression in his eyes was carefully blank. "I spoke without thinking. It won't happen again. You're lying. I'm being practical. You're being a coward." The accusation hung in the air between them. For a moment, Avery thought she saw him flinch, saw a crack in his perfect composure. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "but cowardice protects what matters." "And what matters to you, Damon? Your reputation? Your company? Your carefully controlled life where nothing unexpected ever happens?" "Yes," he said simply. "All of those things. What about me? Do I matter?" The question seemed to cost him something. His jaw tightened, and when he spoke, his voice was rougher than usual. "You matter too much, that's the problem." The confession was barely out of his mouth before he seemed to regret it. He straightened, his expression closing off again. "I have work to do," he said, moving toward his office. "We both need to remember why we're here." "I remember perfectly," Avery called after him. "The question is whether you're brave enough to remember what we could be." He paused in the doorway of his office but didn't turn around. "Good night, Avery." The door closed with a soft click, leaving Avery alone in the living room with the memory of Parisian rain and firelight and confessions that apparently meant nothing in the cold light of Chicago reality. She stood there for a long time, staring at the closed door, understanding with perfect clarity that the man who had held her hand and shared his fears was gone. In his place was the stranger she had married, controlled, distant, and determined to keep it that way. The wall was back up, higher and stronger than before, and this time, Avery wasn't sure either of them had the courage to tear it down. The heart can only pretend for so long before it demands the truth, even if the truth destroys everything. 3 weeks passed in careful, agonizing politeness. 3 weeks of shared breakfasts where they discussed the weather. 3 weeks of perfunctory kisses on the cheek when photographers were present. 3 weeks of Damon working 18-hour days while Avery visited her mother and pretended her heart wasn't breaking a little more each day. It was her mother who finally forced the conversation Avery had been avoiding. "You look tired, sweetheart," Lillian Bennett said during one of her clear moments, studying her daughter's face with the sharp perception that Alzheimer's couldn't quite steal. "Are you sleeping?" "I'm fine, Mom." "That's not what I asked." Her mother's hand found hers, still warm and comforting despite everything the disease had taken. "What's wrong?" Avery tried to smile, tried to maintain the facade that everything in her perfect new life was exactly as it should be. But sitting in her mother's small room at Willowbrook, surrounded by the familiar smell of lavender and the soft sounds of life being carefully maintained, she couldn't keep the mask in place. "I think I made a mistake," she whispered. "What kind of mistake?" "I married someone for the wrong reasons. And now," Avery's voice broke, "now I love him, and he doesn't want to be loved." Her mother was quiet for a long time, her thumb stroking across Avery's knuckles in the same soothing pattern she'd used when Avery was small and afraid of thunderstorms. "Love isn't a mistake, sweetheart, even when it hurts. Especially when it hurts." "So, but what if he can't love me back?" "Then you'll have to decide if loving him anyway is worth the price you're paying." That night, Avery sat in the penthouse living room, staring out at Chicago's glittering skyline and thinking about prices, about the cost of security versus the cost of heartbreak, about what it meant to love someone who had built walls so high that even he couldn't see over them anymore. She was still sitting there when Damon came home at nearly midnight, his tie loosened and exhaustion written in the lines around his eyes. "You're up late," he said, pausing in the doorway. "Couldn't sleep." He hesitated, and for a moment she thought he might sit down beside her, might ask what was wrong, might remember the man he'd been in Paris who cared about her thoughts and fears. Instead, he said, "I have an early meeting tomorrow. Good night, Damon." The sound of his name stopped him halfway to his office. "We can't keep doing this." "Doing what?" "Pretending. Acting like strangers. Ignoring what happened between us." His shoulders tensed. "Nothing happened between us. Everything happened between us." The words exploded out of her, months of careful politeness finally cracking. "You told me I mattered. You kissed me like I was the only thing in the world worth kissing. You held my hand and shared your fears and made me believe that maybe, just maybe, this could be real." It was a moment of weakness. It was a moment of honesty. Avery stood, her hands clenched at her sides. "For one night you let me see who you really are. And then you got scared and ran back behind your walls and your contracts and your careful, controlled life." Damon turned slowly, his face a mask of composure that didn't quite hide the storm in his eyes. "You're reading too much into—" "I'm reading exactly what was there, what's still there, no matter how hard you try to deny it." "Avery, stop." "Why? Because it's easier to pretend I'm just another business transaction? Because admitting you have feelings might make you human instead of a machine? Because this isn't what we agreed to." The words came out louder than he'd intended, and the silence that followed felt explosive. "Because I can't be what you want me to be." "What do you think I want you to be?" "Someone who believes in love. Someone who can give you the fairy tale you deserve. Someone who won't disappoint you when you realize that contracts are safer than promises and money is more reliable than emotions." The raw honesty in his voice made Avery's chest tight. "You think I want a fairy tale? Don't you?" "I want you," she said simply. "Not some perfect version of you. Not some romantic hero from a movie. Just you. The man who researched Alzheimer's because it mattered to me. The man who remembered my work and made me feel brilliant. The man who was brave enough to admit he was falling for someone he was supposed to keep at arm's length." Damon's composure cracked, just slightly. "I can't what? Can't love me? Or can't admit that you already do?" The question hung between them like a challenge. For a moment, Avery saw something raw and desperate flicker across his face. The same vulnerability she'd glimpsed in Paris. The same longing he'd tried so hard to bury. Then his expression shuttered completely. "I can't give you what you want. What I want is honesty. What I want is for you to stop hiding behind this contract like it's armor. What I want is for you to fight for us instead of running away every time things get real. There is no us, Avery. There's an arrangement. A business transaction, nothing more." The words hit like physical blows, each one carefully chosen to wound. Avery stared at him, at this man she'd somehow fallen in love with despite every rational reason not to, and felt something inside her break. "You're right," she said quietly. "There is no us, because that would require two people willing to be honest about what they feel. And you'd rather destroy this than admit you're capable of loving someone. Avery, I want a divorce. The words fell into the silence like stones into still water, sending ripples through everything they'd built. Damon went very still. What did you say? I want a divorce. I want out of this contract, out of this marriage, out of this life where I have to pretend that loving you doesn't feel like dying a little bit every day. Your mother's medical expenses will be my problem, like they were before. Avery's voice was steady now, strengthened by decision. I'd rather be broke and honest than rich and living a lie. You're being emotional, I'm being human, something you might try sometime. The cruelty of the words surprised even her, but she was beyond caring. She was beyond pretending that politeness mattered when her heart was breaking in real time. Damon stared at her for a long moment, his face carved from stone. If that's what you want, it's what I need. She moved toward the staircase, then paused. You know what the saddest part is? You're so afraid of being hurt that you've forgotten how to be happy. And you're so convinced that love will destroy you that you're destroying it first. Avery, my lawyer will contact yours about the paperwork. I'll be out by the weekend. She made it halfway up the stairs before his voice stopped her. I never wanted this to happen. She turned back to look at him, this man who held her heart and didn't know what to do with it. I know, she said softly. That's the tragedy, isn't it? You never wanted to fall in love with me, and I never wanted to fall in love with someone too afraid to love me back. The penthouse fell silent except for the distant hum of the city below. Two people who had started as strangers and become something neither had planned, stood on opposite sides of a chasm that felt impossible to cross. And for the first time since she'd signed that contract, Avery Bennett Caldwell walked away from the only security she'd ever known, choosing her broken heart over a broken life. Behind her, Damon stood alone in the living room, where they'd shared their first honest conversation, surrounded by everything money could buy and nothing his heart actually wanted. Outside, Chicago glittered in the darkness, indifferent to the fact that two people had just shattered everything they'd built together, one painful truth at a time. 6 months later, true love isn't about perfect timing, it's about perfect courage. The small cafe on Michigan Avenue had become Avery's sanctuary, a place where she could work on her laptop, sip overpriced coffee, and pretend that the familiar ache in her chest was getting easier to bear. 6 months after walking away from Damon Caldwell and the life that had never quite felt like hers, she was finally learning how to breathe again. Her phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Martinez at Northwestern. Patent approval came through. Congratulations, Dr. Bennett. Your cardiovascular monitoring device is going to save lives. Dr. Bennett. She'd gone back to school using the money she'd saved from her brief marriage, throwing herself into research with the kind of desperate focus that came from needing something to fill the spaces where love used to live. The work was good, important even. Her device could revolutionize emergency cardiac care, making advanced monitoring available in ambulances and rural hospitals. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like surviving. Excuse me, is this seat taken? Avery looked up from her laptop to find an elderly woman with kind eyes and an elegant cane standing beside the empty chair across from her. Of course, please. Avery moved her papers aside. I'm sorry, I tend to spread out. Working hard? The woman asked as she settled into the chair. Research project. Medical devices. Avery gestured to her screen, where diagrams and data charts covered every inch. Not very exciting unless you're into cardiovascular monitoring. How fascinating. My late husband was a cardiologist. He would have been very interested in your work. The woman's smile was warm, reminiscent. He always said the most important innovations came from people who understood that behind every data point was a human heart that needed protecting. Something about the phrase made Avery's chest tighten. He sounds like a wise man. He was, though it took him far too long to realize that protecting hearts isn't just about medicine. It's about having the courage to risk your own. Before Avery could respond, her phone rang. The number on the screen made her freeze. Marcus, Damon's assistant, had called exactly once in the 6 months since the divorce, to confirm the final paperwork details. She'd changed her number twice since then. Somehow he'd found her again. Excuse me, she murmured to the elderly woman stepping outside to answer. Marcus? Miss Bennett, I'm sorry to bother you, but his usual professional composure seemed frayed. It's about Mr. Caldwell. Avery's heart stopped. What about him? He's been in an accident. Car collision on Lakeshore Drive. Marcus's voice caught. He's in surgery at Northwestern Memorial. It's serious. The phone slipped from her suddenly numb fingers. She barely registered picking it up, barely heard herself saying she'd be right there, barely felt her legs carrying her to the street to hail a taxi. 20 minutes later, she stood in the surgical waiting room of Northwestern Memorial, still wearing her coffee-stained sweater and jeans, staring at Marcus, who looked like he'd aged 10 years. "How bad?" she asked. "Internal bleeding. Possible brain trauma. They've been operating for 3 hours." He looked at her with something like relief. "I didn't know who else to call. He doesn't have anyone else." The words hit harder than they should have. Damon, who had built an empire and commanded respect from thousands of people, was alone in the most important moment of his life. "Have you heard anything?" "Not since they took him in." The other driver ran a red light, hit the passenger side. If Damon hadn't been driving alone, Marcus trailed off, the implication clear. If he'd been with someone, a wife, a girlfriend, anyone, that person would likely be dead. They waited in silence, punctuated only by the soft murmur of other families grappling with their own crises. Avery found herself remembering fragments. The way Damon's eyes had softened when he talked about her research, the sound of his laugh in that Parisian restaurant, the feeling of his hand covering hers during turbulence, the way he'd looked when she'd asked for a divorce, like she was taking away the only real thing he'd ever allowed himself to want. "Miss Bennett?" Avery looked up to find a surgeon in scrubs, her expression carefully neutral in the way doctors practiced when delivering news that could go either way. "I'm Dr. Chen. Is he alive?" "He's alive. The surgery went well. We were able to repair the internal bleeding and there's no sign of permanent brain damage. But," the doctor paused, "he's been asking for you. Rather insistently, actually. He seems to think you're still his wife." "I'm not," Avery said quietly. "We're divorced. Medically speaking, that doesn't matter. What matters is that he's conscious, stable, and asking for someone named Avery who apparently has green eyes and saves lives for a living." Something broke open in Avery's chest. "Can I see him?" Damon looked smaller in the hospital bed, surrounded by machines that beeped and hummed with mechanical precision. His face was bruised, his left arm in a cast, but his eyes were clear when they found hers. "You came," he said, his voice rough from the breathing tube they'd removed an hour earlier. Marcus called. "I didn't ask him to." "I know." Avery moved to the chair beside his bed, careful not to touch any of the wires and tubes keeping him alive. "How do you feel?" "Like I got hit by a truck," which ironically is fairly accurate. He tried to smile, but it came out more like a wince. "Avery, I need to tell you something. You need to rest. I need to tell you this before I lose my courage again." His good hand reached for hers, and after a moment's hesitation, she let him take it. "When I saw that truck coming toward me, when I realized I might die, you know what I thought about?" She waited. "I thought about Paris. About sitting by that fire with you, feeling more like myself than I ever had before. And I thought about how stupid I was to throw that away because I was afraid. Damon, I was wrong. About everything. About us. About love. About what matters." His thumb brushed across her knuckles, the gesture achingly familiar. "I thought keeping you at distance would protect us both. All I did was waste 6 months we could have spent being happy." Tears she'd been holding back for months finally spilled over. "You broke my heart." "I know. I broke mine too." His voice was barely a whisper. "I know I don't deserve another chance. I know I hurt you in ways that might be unforgivable. But if there's any part of you that still what? Still loves me? Still believes we could be something real?" Avery stared down at their joined hands, at the hospital bracelet around his wrist, at the man who had just survived a brush with death and was using his first conscious moments to ask for forgiveness. "I never stopped loving you," she admitted, "even when I hated you for making me feel like love was a weakness. It's not a weakness. It's the only strength that matters." His eyes searched her face. "Avery, I love you. Not because of a contract or an arrangement or because it makes business sense. I love you because you make me want to be brave enough to deserve you. And if I give you another chance, if we try this again, then I promise you this: no more contracts, no more walls, no more pretending that what we have isn't the most real thing in my life." Avery looked at him, bruised, vulnerable, finally willing to risk everything for the possibility of love, and felt her heart make a decision her head hadn't quite caught up to yet. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay, we can try again, but not as business partners or contract spouses. If we do this, we do it as two people who choose each other every day, even when it's scary." The smile that spread across Damon's face was worth every moment of heartbreak that had led them here, especially when it's scary. he agreed. 3 months later, they stood in the small chapel at Willowbrook Memory Center, surrounded by a handful of friends and the residents who had adopted Avery as their own. Lillian Bennett, having one of her clearer days, walked her daughter down the aisle while Damon waited at the altar with tears in his eyes. This time, when they exchanged vows, every word was true. This time, when he kissed her, it was a promise instead of a performance. And this time, when someone asked them how they'd found each other, they told the truth. Sometimes love begins with a contract, but it only becomes real when you're brave enough to tear up the paperwork and trust your heart instead. Outside the chapel, Chicago sparkled in the late afternoon sun, indifferent to the fact that two people had just chosen love over fear, hope over safety, and each other over everything else that had once seemed important. Some stories begin with, "Once upon a time." Others begin with, "I have a proposition for you." But the best stories, the ones worth telling, begin with two people brave enough to believe that love is always worth the risk, even when the risk is everything. The end. He promised her a marriage without feelings, but what began as strategy became the greatest love story either of them had ever known. Your engagement is very important to our channel. Please leave your opinion in the comments. What would you have done in Avery's place? Would you have been brave enough to love someone like Damon knowing the risks? Share your thoughts below. We love hearing from you. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to our channel and leave a comment below letting us know what you thought. Your feedback and support mean a lot to us. Stay tuned for more exciting stories.